opinions expressed in this show belong to the person expressing them. They do not purport to reflect the opinions or views of Rancher or any other entity.
Good morning, Internet! Welcome to today's episode of Coffee and Cloud Native. My name is Adrian Goins, and I'm excited to be here with you today. The purpose of this show is to share with you news and interesting content related to Kubernetes and Cloud Native, and to build a community of people who are interested in using technology to live a better life. And I say that as though everybody who's watching is new. Actually, everybody who's watching already knows that, and I'm super glad that y'all are here to hang out with me first thing in my weekly morning. Nice job, WifeBot got the reference to Good Morning Vietnam. If you're watching live, whether you're a longtime watcher or not, subscribe to the channel if you're not already subscribed. But always, please, click the thumbs up button or whatever the like button is so that YouTube shares it with other people, whether you're watching now or in the future. And if you are watching new your first time, welcome. Join us on the Discord server, which is where like the super craziness happens. Even though that chat gets relayed, over here is where it is. So let's take a moment and say hello to those who have joined us today. Good morning, Mac. M. Layden. Hello. Ariel. Mose. Nice to see you. OFS. OFS is a relatively new member of our community, so everybody please take a moment to say hello. Vito. My job titles. I actually forgot to run a poll last week for what my title should be this week, and I thought about just using last week's title, and then I was like, I can make up my own titles. So there you go. I am a senior configuration synergist this week. Gotta love it. Maybe I can get a raise. Old man with a hat. Hello. Peter Keach. Stephen K. We were talking about dogs smiling and how people see different, like depending on your relationship with dogs. Somebody posted a gif of a dog that I saw as smiling and being cute. But the baring of the teeth is often seen as growling and being scary. There's a lot to learn in that about how we perceive the world around us, not just with dogs, but with people. Maybe the people that we think are terrifying aren't. That's all I'm going to say about that. Andrew McIver from from YouTube. Hello again, Mac. Thank you very much. I don't know if I said hi to Ian. We're at the part of the scrolling back where everybody's names just start to blend together. I saw Wojtek earlier. Cześć. Frank, hello. All right, let's get started. First of all, how's the weekly challenge going? If you're not familiar with the weekly challenge, there it is. December is policy month, so I challenged everybody for the first weekly challenge, which is running until Wednesday, to learn something about policy engines, Kyverno or OPA, or write your own, or do whatever you want. Technically, pod security policies would go in there, but I intentionally left it out. We might have an article that comes up today that talks about why. Well, actually, it'll allow me to talk about why. The article doesn't talk about why, but whatever. That's foreshadowing. If you were watching in Discord, did a bunch of work this weekend just to get ready for this. Well, actually, not entirely for this. This is going to make any sense at all. I upgraded WordPress for WifeBot and upgraded my proper WordPress container, which somebody asked me to make a video about, so I'll try to do that in the last 2 weeks of the year. Then I deployed Glue because I wanted to set up some rate limiting on people pounding on the WP login part of WordPress. Then I had to migrate everything off of my ingresses over to Glue, and then in all of this, there was like some other nonsensey stuff. And then yesterday afternoon, I finally felt that the cluster was at a state where I could deploy Kyverno. And so that's what I did. And if you saw, where's my button? Where's my button? If you saw my comments, I'm doing this so that I can not only learn things, but also so that I can force myself to do what I'm supposed to do. So I deployed Kyverno with just a couple of policies, one for requiring that everything have the kubernetes.io/app name label, and requests and limits for CPU and memory. And as you can see, most of my stuff doesn't. I have it deployed in audit mode, so it's simply telling me the things that are wrong, and then I'm going to go through and start fixing these and excluding namespaces for things that don't care. Oh, and the other thing I did for all of this is because I was going down the rabbit hole of deploying virtual services and stuff, I actually started to build out a GitOps environment. So I want to give a shout out to OneDrop, who has a wonderful GitOps repo that I was able to look at and pull ideas from, and not yet ready to flip the switch on that, but I've started building out namespaces and the apps and things like that. Yeah, so it was a pretty big weekend. And I'm going to jump back over to the chat now and see if anybody had. Oh my god, it's all GIFs, so I can't even see if anybody did anything. All right, if any of you did anything, actually mention my name so that. Oh, Moses asking if the challenge is still open. It's not like a challenge like it ends on Wednesday. It's just on Wednesday there's going to be another weekly challenge. So there's no prize, there's no anything. This is so that we're all kind of working on the same general thing, and then we can help each other if there are questions, or we can talk about our experiences. So on Wednesday I'll have another weekly challenge for the next week that'll force us to all go do something else. But they're optional. You don't have to participate if you don't want to. Hey Nuno, thanks for joining us. Uh, okay, so if any of you did anything with Kyverno or OPA, actually mention my name so that I can hear it. Make sure I got my audio on. Oh, that's why it's on my headphones, which are not plugged in. Let's switch that over. And now, yeah. So let's get into the actual content of today, and I'll look back. Otherwise, we're gonna sit here waiting, and that's no fun for anyone. What does that mean? What does that mean? What does it mean? What does it mean? It means it's time for the A/B test. The collector bots have gathered candidates for the show, and Trufflebot has scored them from 1 to 5 coffees. And I know if you're watching, you already know this, but there are sometimes new people. So 1 to 5 coffees means a 75 to 100% probability of being interesting content. He's going to post them one at a time in the A/B test channel on Discord, and I'll load them up. Anyone who's watching live can rate them in Discord, and then the final scores are shown when we move to the next item. Yeah, so I'm going to try and shorten my speechy things so that, oops, that's an unknown command, so that I have more time to do other stuff. Okay. Ha, foreshadowing works. I intentionally left pod security policies out of policy month, out of the thing. Though technically they were they're still there and they're still valid. So let's first talk about what they are, and if you're interested in exploring them, this article is fantastic. So here you go. Pod security policies allow you to control what configuration your pods should have before they're allowed to be deployed. So things like must not run as root, or cannot use privilege mode, SE Linux enforcement, supplemental groups, FS group, volumes, so on and so forth. You can get pretty granular with how these things are deployed. Pod security policies have been around forever. They predate OPA and Kyverno, but they have some shortcomings. Namely, they're limited in what they can do. Pod security policies compared to other things that can enforce policies on all sorts of things. And basically, you create a policy and you apply it, and then it just kind of works or it doesn't. And there's not a lot of visibility into whether it works or well. It's clearly visible if it's not working because it's doing something you didn't want it to do, or it's not doing something you did want it to do. But they still deserve at least a mention. So if you are in an environment where you cannot deploy something like OPA or Kyverno, you can use pod security policies if they're enabled for your cluster. And it's probably easier for your cluster administrators to flip those switches and get those things in place, or they're already there. So if you are interested in going down the PSP path, there's an article for that. Next up, I've discovered that I do this thing now where I'm not really sure why. I think it came from the show where I type and then I hit enter, but I go bam, and my hand comes across I'm actually I just realized it looks like something totally different. I swear to God, I'm hitting the enter key. Crap. Okay, moving on. Next up, continuing on with policy mode. We have Styra DAS. Now, I chose to go with Kyverno, and I've talked a lot about why that is. But OPA Gatekeeper is baked into Rancher and is honestly, I think OPA has some advantages. I have itch on my back. Has some advantages over Kyverno in the fact that you can run. Oh, somebody just shouted out my name. Dun, dun, dun. Why is OPA when you have Kyverno? Okay, so there's a question from M. Layden saying, I try to use the same labels and limits from this URL, but I'm confused. Why use OPA when you have Kyverno? And he posted a link to Chip Zoller's blog talking about, oh yeah, so requiring labels. So this is similar to the policy that I deployed. So the question is, why use OPA when you have Kyverno? If you have Kyverno, you don't need to use OPA. Unless you want policy enforcement for things outside of just Kubernetes. And as I was just starting to say, that I think is the primary advantage that OPA has over Kyverno. OPA works for all sorts of things and works for Kubernetes. So you can get a more holistic total architecture configuration. Also, and this is nothing against Kyverno, Styra has some things that make OPA easier, well, not easier necessarily to learn because Kyverno is pretty easy, but they have, for example, the playground, so you can mess around with OPA policies. They have this DAS, which stands for Declarative Authorization Service. Ooh, that's very serious sounding. And they have a free version of this with limited functionality, and it includes things like a Rego editor. Let's just scroll down to that. So it's got this really nice UI for configuring policies, testing policies, deploying them, switching them from just monitor mode to enforcement mode, a decisions area to see what kinds of things your policies have discovered. So this interactive configuration and management utility for OPA is actually really sexy. Not so sexy that I'm going to stop using Kyverno, but it's still really sexy. So this is an article about how you can get started with that. If you chose OPA or if you already have OPA deployed, this is fairly new. And, well, yeah, like I already said, it's sexy. What do you need? You need more than that? It's sexy. Let's jump back over here and see. Mac wants to know, does OPA work for Swarm? I don't know. All right, next up we have. Okay. Last week we were all talking about this whole Kubernetes Docker shim deprecation thing. It was very popular and it's still super popular. We're getting lots and lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of chatter about it. And buried in all of that noise was this. Mirantis stepped up. Mirantis was like, hey, community, don't worry about it. We'll take over support for it. The reason that Kubernetes was going to deprecate Docker shim is because it hasn't seen maintenance. So they don't want to continue to support this thing that's just going to become cruftier and cruftier. So Mirantis literally came up and said, okay, fine, no problem. They worked out a deal with Docker. They said, let's take that over. They're going to make it CRI compliant, and then they're going to release it as open source. If you already use Mirantis's container runtime for stuff, you don't have to worry about it. You'll be taken care of as well. Good job, Mirantis. Like, wow. Everybody out there was crying that this thing was going to go away, myself included, and finding solutions for how to deal with it going away, like just go run containerd. And Mirantis realized that it doesn't have to go away, which is like a meta layer around the problem analysis that I'm very impressed by. You should still just run containerd. I often see people asking, about why it takes so long for Kubernetes to detect node failures. and to move pods to somewhere else. You can mitigate some of this with liveness and readiness probes. Well, I guess liveness probes on your workloads, but liveness probes have their own host of challenges where you can, you can end up having Kubernetes nuke your pods prematurely. This is an older article, but it popped up yesterday, and it talks about the various timing parameters that are associated with this. So you got something that checks every minute. Let's see. So pod eviction timeout is set to 5 minutes, and then you have node monitor grace period, and then you have so it combines node monitor grace period plus pod eviction timeout, and ultimately you end up with 5 minutes and 40 seconds before Kubernetes realizes that a node is down and starts to evict its pods. The knee-jerk response to this is to make all those limits much lower. But in reducing them, you can also end up in a situation where things are getting evicted and moved around inappropriately, much like doing the thing with the liveness probes. Though they do recommend, so here for example, with changing these parameters, you can drop it from 5 minutes and 40 seconds down to 36 seconds. That's probably a little bit too low, but tweaking and tuning, you can get it up to somewhere between 45 seconds and a minute, which is probably okay. And then as long as you also incorporate readiness probes, at least readiness probes, because then pods will drop out of the services when they're no longer responding, but they won't necessarily get nuked. So that's just a good thing to have anyway. So if your pods are busy and they're not responding in time, they don't continue to get slammed with traffic. And there's other solutions that could probably help this, maybe with service mesh or stuff. But if you're wondering, if you're used to a world where something detects that it's down and it moves it, and you're alarmed by the fact that Kubernetes takes basically 6 minutes to figure that out, just read this article and understand that it's by design, and then tune it as appropriate for your environment. Now I'm really self-conscious about my enter key over here. DBA from the Cold returns with an article that actually predates the article we had from last week. Because every night, as part of my workload, when I'm screening these, they get loaded into the database, and then when they actually get extracted by Trufflebot, he extracts them based on priority. So if he's rated something higher, it's more likely to show up. It was a weekend, so there wasn't a lot going on. So we're ending up with some stuff that's a little lower rated, but from last week, but still interesting because Trufflebot isn't necessarily always right in how he rates stuff. Last week we had DBA from the Cold on talking about migrating his Raspberry Pi cluster from Docker to Containerd. Well, this is an article that's actually about him building his new Raspberry Pi cluster for Kubernetes. If you've built a Kubernetes cluster, there's probably not a lot here. If you've built a Kubernetes cluster on Raspberry Pi, there's probably also not a lot here. Or if you've done anything with Raspberry Pi, it basically starts from zero and says, here's all the hardware that I bought. I'll bet you these are affiliate links. No, they're not. I'm surprised. Well, even if they were, you should click them because he does good stuff for us. I'm posting this because if you've never built a Kubernetes cluster on Raspberry Pi, or if you've never built a Kubernetes cluster at all, then this is cool. But further down, I ran into, let's see, he goes nuts, like nuts. You just follow this thing step by step. Just grab yourself a couple of beers and a bunch of Raspberry Pis and rock and roll. So this is all kubeadm based. He gets down here and he deploys Metal LB because he wants to deploy. Where did it go? Joining the other nodes, blah blah blah. External kube control access, Azure SQL Edge. And the part of my brain that wonders what things is said, what the heck is that? So Azure SQL Edge is something that apparently doesn't come up in my history, even though I was looking at it this morning. I first looked at this and I was like, really? $60 for a SQL database that's cloud enabled or something? And I kind of was like, nah. But it actually looks pretty cool. In that it has, so it's the engine that's from SQL Server, which works because it runs a bunch of stuff. But it has some really interesting AI functionality baked into it that allows you to detect anomalies, or I didn't look into really how this works, but to do sort of like a data analysis stuff in the database that's deployed at the edge before backhauling that data back into wherever. I don't know. Do any of you use this? Have any of you do? If you use this and you have any thoughts about it, I'm curious to know what your experience is, how it works, and what additional benefits it provides over just a standard open source SQL database that justifies $60 per device per year, and if any of the magic that it claims that it has actually works. Apparently, it works on a Raspberry Pi. Sweet. Maybe there is actually a free tier. So there you go. Building a Raspberry Pi cluster and deploying Azure services onto it. Next up, from the Dreaming Philosophy Department, Stefan wrote an article where he referred to GitHub and GitLab as Git forges. Okay, that sounds cool. I like the idea of a forge, hammering out metal and making weapons or whatever, horseshoes, I don't know, like blacksmithing. It's one of my favorite things to do in Skyrim. He looked at the functionality that these provide and how they've gone from being just Git repositories to being a von Neumann, having a von Neumann architecture and being Turing complete. I didn't click on those to figure out how he arrived at those conclusions. I just accepted that he did. And he postulates what would have to happen to turn them into basically serverless application platforms. And he calls this a Git Forge app. And it's an app that runs entirely in GitHub or GitLab. And he looked at how you could combine the CI pipeline functionality with pages, with branching, with how to store data, with triggers. So you couldn't do real-time stuff, but having it like as an RSS feed where it like something serverless style, where something is triggered and then generates output, and that output is consumed statically until the next time the trigger happens. It's a really interesting article. It says that you can't actually do this now, and there are some limitations that they would have to figure out. And I highlighted this. Okay, good. So he says here, for example, I have a Git repo for building a container image that I deploy on my server and that pushes output files to a web server host. All of that can be replaced with a Git repository that runs a job and pushes to GitLab pages or GitHub pages. This simplifies things and frees me from maintaining infrastructure. And when I read that, I realized that I deploy a lot of things in a traditional way just out of habit. Like I come from the day of, you build a server and you install Apache on it and then you put your stuff in, you make an NFS thing and you do all of this stuff. But that doesn't necessarily mean that it's the right way to do it today. It doesn't mean that my way is wrong, but I want to always stay curious and decide if the way that I'm doing things today, well, if the way that I did things yesterday is the way that I still need to do them today. This would work already for publishing a static website. The cncn.io website is static. It's made with Hugo because I'm a Hugo nerd. But I could do this lots of other ways that would probably reduce the amount of infrastructure I have to actually pay for. Since I pay for all this out of my own pocket, that's worth considering. Now, not to go so far as to like take every new and shiny tool the instant that it comes out, but good to keep in mind. One more before tool of the day. This is not as interesting. It was a weekend, so we were reaching a little bit. Serverless. Everyone's like, serverless. And this was the first thing I've seen that says that actually it's not a hockey stick. It's kind of flatlining. There are some interesting points in here from a data perspective. If you're considering serverless and you're trying to decide container or serverless, this is one of the few articles that I've read that says no, it's containers and serverless, because they try to say that legacy applications are going into containers and new applications are going into serverless. I don't like the word legacy because that implies old and like unsupportable and lots of other stuff. There's too much baggage around the word legacy. There are things that are appropriate for serverless, and there are things that are appropriate for containers. There are things that just aren't going to run well in serverless. Go run MariaDB in serverless. No. Now there are other databases that do work, but whatever. That's not the point. I agree that new application development is considering serverless because I also see that in myself. I hated the concept of serverless. I thought it was the stupidest idea ever. Just a little pro tip here. Anything that Adrian thinks is the dumbest idea ever is probably going to be really successful. I don't know why that is, but I've seen it time and time and time and time again. So yeah, I hated serverless. Look at where we are today. So serverless is appropriate for things. I see that when I'm deciding how to deploy an application, or how to develop an application, even like the bots and stuff like that, anything that's an event-driven architecture is appropriate for serverless, and I consider that in the landscape of stuff before I make a decision about where I'm going to put something. So it's a cool article. There's a bunch of metrics and numbers and percentages and graphs and things like that. Do I have any comments around here? So containers and serverless is the norm, not the exception. Yep. Oh, this is interesting. In 2020, New Relic reported that organizations with AWS Lambda in production had approximately doubled the number of functions they used and how often the functions were invoked each week. There's a name for this that I didn't go look up, but basically, if something is available, people will use it. The more available it is, the more people will use it. So this is just a proof of that. It doesn't prove that serverless is better or being adopted more. It proves that if you make something available, people will use it. When I first bought an MP3 player, it had a 120 gigabyte hard drive in it. And I asked my friend, I was like, I have 10 gigs of music. Why do I need the 120 gig MP3 player? And he said, trust me, you'll fill it. And I did. So that's just, watch out for statistics like that. Interesting article. There you go. May it help you make better decisions. I have workers here today. I don't know if you've seen them outside the window. I'm using the crisp microphone to try and reduce the sound of them painting and hammering. So today's show had an average of 4 ratings. Ah, man, I love it. Trufflebot, on point. You know what that means? It means the show's going to run late. That means Adrian can't type tool of the day. The tool of the day is Locust. Somebody just said my name. Say my name. Oh, Mac. Mac's like the king of the one-liners. That was good. That was good. Point for Mac. Locust, an open source load testing tool. It's not actually a load testing tool. Later on in their documentation, they describe it as a performance testing tool. And while it looks like their webpage is broken, if you scroll, it just the stuff. Hello, UX people. That makes it look like the webpage didn't load. Anyway. Define user behavior in code. This is open source. It's got a nice UI, and I like that everything is written in Python. So you can use it for performance testing across the board, and just makes it really easy to write your tests. The easier it is to deploy a testing framework, the more likely people are to do it. And while this is not chaos engineering, load testing or performance testing is an important part of stuff. They say that, in fact, Battlefield Games loads, so Battlelog, the web app for Battlefield Games, is load tested on Locust. So you can simulate latencies and multiple users, and you can apparently just slam the heck out of it or back off or do whatever, all using really simple Python code stuff. So that's your tool of the day. I'm interested if anybody uses it or takes it for a spin, and what you think. Locust. Open source performance testing. Whatever image that is that Mac just posted is really cool. Huh. Okay. 2 points for Mac. Let's get out of here. So we all got work to do, right? Dun, 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 dun. Yeah. I totally forgot what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to leave. I'm supposed to talk. I'm supposed to wrap this up. I'm supposed to, I don't know. But that's all for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Links to everything I talk about on the show go up in the free community site at community.cncn.io. Come join us. You'll get early access to the links, video replay, and other exclusive content. It's free to join. More people are joining it every single day. If you have something you would like for me to consider for the show, post it in the community site, mention me in the post, or ping me on Discord or Twitter. Have a great day, everyone. Keep learning. I will see you in the next show. Stay caffeinative.